There's a good reason you've probably never heard of the ultra-prestigious Webcomic List Awards, and that's because it was born and died almost immediately. But it actually left a mark on the webcomic world, with ties to Lackadaisy before it joined the likes of Hazbin Hotel and The Amazing Digital Circus as an animated pilot on YouTube. Keep your Pulitzer Prize and Hugo Awards, your Marvel Comics and DC Comics. Today we're talking about Webcomic Awards. Accolades reserved solely for those indie artists publishing a work exclusively online. Specifically, the one that crashed and burned quicker than any other annual award. Twice, somehow. Its story starts long after what is the oldest webcomic, dropped in the 80s, and it had a really unique gimmick. The awards themselves were presented in a webcomic by characters from different series and artists. The digital medium gets shafted more often than not when it comes to mainstream recognition, so it makes sense for internet denizens to take matters into their own hands. The hands of, for the sake of this story, webcomic list site owner Ash Young and his staff Chilari and Wendy Wood. They created their own award show for comics online. Sure, we've seen the Webby Awards blow up and webtoons host their own events nowadays, but looking back at the first 40 years of internet artists, anything even resembling mainstream recognition was few and far between. Even the previously mentioned Lackadaisy was only considered a niche fandom before it hit YouTube. Plenty of groups and websites have tried to start their own annual online comics award ceremonies, but the vast majority of them fail to catch on. Either word doesn't spread, no one tunes in, no news sites report on the results, or, God forbid, controversy strikes. There's any number of things that can go wrong and prematurely cancel an annual event. Most of these fade off into obscurity, never to be mentioned again. So, what makes the Webcomic List Awards the exception? Why is it worthy of its footnote in the history of webcomics? Well, that's what we're going to dig into today. Welcome to Zombie Comics. I do content all about webcomics, indie comic artists, and the history of comics online. I always appreciate a subscribe, like, comment, and the usual YouTube stuff. And without further ado, let's talk about a story that starts back in the 2000s. It's a story about mainstream disrespect, Lackadaisy, disappointed Wikipedia editors, and award show prestige. It's the story of the rather quick birth and death of the Webcomic List Awards. Webcomics have been around since the 80s, with comics like Witches and Stitches and THE Fox being circulated on the early internet. However, comics published online weren't even considered for awards until the next millennium. A couple of the early adopters for recognizing online comics at all included the Ursa Major Awards and the Eagle Awards. The Ursa Major Awards focus on films, games, comics, and media that prominently feature anthropomorphic characters. Winners have included things like Finding Nemo and Wallace and Gromit. Ever since the awards started in 2001, webcomic nominations were very common. Jack by David Hopkins, Kevin and Kel by Bill Holbrook, and Living in Greytown by Dave Kelly were all among nominees the first year the Ursa Major Awards started. And as a side note on Lackadaisy again, they have a long history with the Ursa Major Awards, suffering as runner-up every year from 2009 to 2012, 2015 to 2017, before finally winning Best Anthropomorphic Graphic Story in 2018.
Thank you!
Meanwhile, the Eagle Awards started a specific category in 2001, titled Favorite Web-Based Comic. But these were all just one category, tucked inside a larger awards event that focused on physical media. Boiling down every webcomic produced in a year into a single winner would require a lot of comparing apples to oranges. Like, yeah, let's compare Marry My Husband to Milk for the Ugly. Luckily, 2001 wasn't just the start of webcomic award categories, we got an entire annual awards event devoted solely to webcomics. The Web Cartoonist Choice Awards was created by Scott Maddox and Mark Mex in 2000, with the first awards going out in 2001. And for the 2000s, this was the webcomic awards. They had tons of categories: Outstanding Comic, Outstanding Black and White Art, genre awards for gaming comics, romance comics, sci-fi comics, they had it all. But all good things must come to an end. After 2008, the Web Cartoonist Choice Award went away. This was a huge blow to the webcomics community. There was finally a group, an annual recognition that gave validation to artists operating online, and now it was just gone. The indie comic artists of the internet weren't about to roll over and give up. This wasn't an end, this was a beginning. There were plenty of people willing to get a new annual webcomic awards rolling, like the aforementioned Ash Young, Chilari, Wendy Wood, and everyone at Webcomic List. The Webcomic List was an internet forum that would notify its users of various online comic-related news, like comic updates, and it was all owned and run by Ash Young. And when they caught wind that the Web Cartoonist Choice Awards went under, they jumped right on it, starting work on their own annual award in late July of 2008. Committee head Wendy Wood and forum moderator Chilari were on board, as were collaborations with web creators themselves, like the German author and Indonesian artist from Sandra and Wu. 2009 marked the first annual Webcomic List Awards, and the first award the site had ever... Wait, what? What the hell happened in 2004? So, it turns out that the Webcomic List Awards was not the first attempt by the site to get an online comic award off the ground. We need to rewind a bit. In 2004, Comics Talk posted a blurb discussing the first incarnation of the Webcomic List Awards. The voting cycle for these awards were open to the public at large, and were presumably started by Ash Young, but even Chilari couldn't be 100% sure who was involved. They certainly weren't. These 2004 awards only had 5 categories, and the winners included the likes of Control-Alt-Delete, Penny Arcade, 8-Bit Theater, and Mega Tokyo. So, cool, good start. How's the next year look? There's only one page to these annual awards, isn't there? Yeah, the initial Webcomic List Awards dropped off after a single year. There's not really any word on how it came about or why it was canceled, but this probably should have been the first red flag. An already failed awards event under Webcomic List's belt doesn't bode well for the revamped version in 2009. But things were different this time, right? There were far more people involved. There was a niche to fill after the Web Cartoonist Choice Awards died off. So they went ahead with it. One of the men working on the Webcomic List Awards project was Michael Slott. He talked a bit about the experience working on the 2009 awards, noting that nominees were open to anyone involved in comics, from writers to artists to site staff, and even in one case, someone who runs a comic store. They're all involved in comics in some way, so they all get a say, and they had a pretty good turnout that year. And the awards? They were presented as full-fledged comics of various characters from different series announcing the winners. The end of his post points readers to the 2009 Webcomics List Awards, or Twickles as some people have chosen to... I'm sorry, I'm not calling them that. Who's calling them that? Michael. Who in their right mind would ever... So like I said before, the coolest thing about the Webcomic List Awards was how they were presented. They weren't just listed like the 2004 version. No, they had a different artist for each category, drawing characters and shenanigans ensuing as they tried to present the winners on stage. Characters from Odori Park by Chris Watkins, Holy Mole by Charlie Thatcher, and Between Places by Metrius all stepped up to announce the winners. This mirrored how the Web Cartoonist Choice Awards operated. They had some pretty entertaining comic strips created purely to present the awards. Then the 2010 Webcomic List Awards came around, and this is where Lackadaisy earned a nomination for Best Black and White Art. It didn't win its category, but now that everyone knows Ivy, Mordecai, and Rocky in their animated form, it's awesome to learn about the earlier days when its story was only told as a webcomic. And you know how movies and shows will still call themselves the Emmy-nominated show and whatnot, because even a nomination at some of these awards is considered prestigious? Info on Lackadaisy proudly displays the Webcomic List Awards nomination right next to their wins from the Web Cartoonist Choice Awards. In fact, most of the nominees and winners do the same. And the awards event gained traction in 2010. News sites picked up the awards for articles and special announcements. Winners wore the award as a badge of honor. People were talking about it. That's what you really want for an awards show, though they did have some obstacles. Wendy Wood had fallen ill during the preparation in this second year, leading to Chilari taking over some of her responsibilities. Chilari said that the 2009 and 2010 awards are based on votes by those involved in webcomics in some way to reach a short list of nominees, and these are judged by volunteer judges. But...
there's just one small problem, and it's a big one.
People were talking, but it wasn't all good. A lot of people really hated the webcomic presentation format. They saw this as a pretty cringy decision for lesser-known comics to basically advertise themselves while talking about far more established ones, which I get the critique, but this was only the first 2 years of the awards. You can't expect them to get the biggest names right out of the gate. But there's always going to be vocal critics online, and Chilari reassured editors over at Wikipedia that they were working hard on building the awards up even more. So it was on to 2011, and there was definitely a surprise in store for those editors.
And the Oscar goes to...
It was time for the Webcomic List Awards 2011, and they didn't release at their usual time. This wasn't uncommon. There are plenty of jokes about artists missing deadlines in the comic industry. Marvel and DC comic artists get into hot water constantly for not delivering on time, and webcomic artists really are no different. Even the Web Cartoonist Choice Awards had seen delays during certain years. So the Webcomic List Awards being late wasn't anything to worry about, right? Well, a delay would be one thing, but we would never see the Webcomic List Awards 2011. Webcomics and video game Wikipedia editor MapleStrip lamented her own disappointment that it didn't continue, and that's really all I could find. 2 years. This annual award only lasted 2 years. So why are the Webcomic List Awards worth talking about at all? Well, like I've been saying, despite how short-lived it was, people were getting into this amateur awards showing. If most mainstream literary and comic awards refuse to acknowledge webcomics, then it's up to the passionate artists in the online community to take matters into their own hands. And when they actually manage to break into news stories, social media, and in turn are proudly displayed by their winners and nominees, it turns into something more legitimate. But just as it started getting its legs underneath it, it ended. It might not be the Oscars and it might not be the Emmys, but it showed that somewhere out there, people cared about the indie artists and readers wanted to see more. The history of webcomics is scattered and largely unorganized, and it's filled with stories like the short-lived Webcomics List Awards. I mentioned earlier the earliest webcomics, Witches and Stitches, but you can't even access it nowadays. And the reason is crazier than you think. If you like this video, you should definitely check out my video about that. And yeah, this has been Zombie Comics, and I'll catch you on the flip side. See ya!